Welcome to the ADD Catastrophe, new and improved, yet still the most distracted opinion show on the internet. I'm Stephen Witten.
And I'm Ryan Ramsey, and we'll be right back after I get done applying my final coat of wax to the Batmobile. Back. Thanks for being here with us today. Today we're talking about a topic that struck me as I was thinking one day. It is the 10-year anniversary of the Batman Begins release. And so I was thinking, it's been 10 years of solid superhero movies coming out. And how has that affected the film industry? And what is going to be the future impact on the film industry? So I wanted to look at this from two angles, from just the regular consumer and then also from the comic book viewer. So, Steven, do you have any thoughts about this that you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So in regards to your first question of how has comic books shaped Hollywood, and in fact how the genre has shaped the Hollywood industry or factory, as you will. I think that
Empire.
Yeah. When you start looking at the comic book movies from the past, you go in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they were really kind of cheesy. They were not that great, but you slapped on a superhero sticker and people went out and saw it. Then you got into the 90s and people were kind of like, nah, and you kind of saw that like flat line of comic books and comic book stories. And then X-Men came out and it kind of just like jump-started the whole comic book industry.
Yeah.
And it kind of that, and then you had Spider-Man, and then you had a few flops, but Batman Begins came out in 2005 and it really just like solidified that the comic book genre was here to stay.
Right. And
it kind of just like it proved Christopher Nolan in his infinite wisdom knew that a good story, no matter what the story was about, if it was a good story, it was going to be successful. I think and he's proved that over and over and over again.
And if you combine that with a superhero genre,
it's going to, blow up
the box office out.
And that's just the truth about anything, really.
And so enter the money-making machine that is Hollywood, and they say, we can make money off of these comic book nerds and everybody else. Because if you would notice one thing, not just comic book nerds go to these movies. They are the first push, usually. But then the big moneymaker is going to be everybody else that goes and sees the movie. So it's kind of interesting that then all of these comic book movies start coming out because they make money, right?
Absolutely.
So with that being the case, how do you think that this has affected the comic book industry? I think that, and I've seen it, that comic books were really struggling in the late 90s.
Oh, yeah.
They were
Hands
almost
down.
to where,
how many comic book companies, like, in the 80s, they had, like, pop-up comic book companies, and then in the late 90s, they all had to close their shops up.
The only ones that I ever remember from the late 90s were, of course, DC and Marvel. Nothing will kill those. But then I remember the one that did Spawn, which was Icon.
Yeah, you had I can't remember any, and that's
So,
about as bad as it was.
So, but what this did was now it revitalized all of these characters. It revitalized all the main branch characters, and now bringing up some other ones. So at first, we hit hard with the Batman and the X-Men, some of the biggest. We have Spider-Mans, but then now with Avengers and other films, we're getting all sorts of Ant-Man, movies, superheroes that weren't big.
Black Panther,
the Black Widow,
Miss Marvel.
Yep, Miss Marvel. And so all these characters are coming back. So what this has done, interestingly, is that for so long, movies tried to copy what they did in comic books. But now you're seeing, for example, Star-Lord, the comic books, after they made the movie, Guardians of the Galaxy, the comic book character began looking like the movie character. And so now the movies are affecting comic books. And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, undoubtedly, as a comic book fan, and I was a comic book fan before the movies came out.
Right.
Now, remember, in 2000, I was 12 years old, so I was like the ripe age for comic books.
Mm-hmm.
So before all these movies, and just for the record, let the record show that as a 12-year-old, my parents did not allow me to go see the movies. So I didn't get to see the X-Men movies like everybody else got to. I actually was still a hardcore comic book fan.
Good Nazarenes.
Yeah. And now, not only am I a comic book fan, but I'm also a comic film fan. Mm-hmm. And yes, as a hardcore comic book fan, it can irritate you at times that the film is starting to affect the comic books. However, it's not a bad thing because it's an ebb and flow. Mm-hmm. Because of the films, there are more comic book readers, meaning there's going to be more comic books needed, which means there needs to be more comic book artists.
However, the argument for the comic books is that the comic book should be the source material, and then the movie should be just pulling from the source material. But
says every sweaty nerd ever.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So now, though, you have the comic book, which is supposed to be the interpretation of the comic book, that the movies are now affecting the comic books, therefore creating this vicious cycle that will spiral down until every comic book goes out of business and you'll never have a comic book ever again.
Question.
What's going to happen, man?
Quick question. Best comic book film ever. Right now. Iron Man?
Mm-hmm.
Who wrote that movie?
I don't know.
Not a comic book artist, not a comic book writer, a filmmaker. That's what I'm saying is like the best superhero, and some would say that The Dark Knight is the best superhero film of all time. And then second would be Avengers, but we're not going to go into that opinion. But what I'm saying is that when you list that like that, Christopher Nolan and Jonathan Nolan wrote The Dark Knight.
Right.
The Avengers was written by Joss Whedon. Now he's a different kind of person because he was actually a comic book, but he started out as a filmmaker, then a comic book writer. Right. So take Joss Whedon out of the thing. Christopher Nolan and Jonathan Nolan wrote The Dark Knight, one of the best. We can put one of the best superhero films of all time. So that being said, you have to realize that comic books are great. They don't have to be the source material. They are the source material just because they created the characters.
So you're saying media is media, and if one interprets the other differently or the same or takes
what
from
does it matter? I mean, if it's giving us a good storyline, at the end of the day, that's all we want. We want entertainment, right? So this kind of leads into, will superhero films and the superhero genre ever deteriorate or decline? And what in the next 10 years do you see or foresee?
I think in the next 10 years, we will see a decline in comic book movies. I think burnout will set in. One of the interesting things, and we talked about this before, was that, there is now the genre of comic book film or, superhero movie, and now there's subgenres within that. So you have heist movies or war movies or, spy movies, stuff like that. So, I think eventually people will get tired of superhero movies, and eventually if they want to survive through the next 10 years, Marvel and all that, which I'm sure they will, so I don't know why I have this opinion, but because Disney owns them and Disney owns the entire world. So unless the world blows up in the next 10 years, they're probably still going to be around. But I do think they're going to have to come up with a technique to avoid burnout, because people will get sick and tired of superheroes, because we're not all comic book nerds like me and you.
Right, but again, it all goes back to the good storylines. As long as they come up with a good storyline, and we've seen it with Spider-Man. They've rebooted it twice, and they're getting ready to reboot it again. I mean, and nobody is batting an eye on it. Marvel has somehow figured out how to weave in and out of this burnout period, and create good stories with subgenres, with different tweaks on the storyline. And DC looks like they're getting ready to do stuff like that. Yeah. So it's like, I don't think we're going to see a burnout, as some people would say. I think we'll see a little bit of a decline, but I think that just comes with Hollywood being cyclical and going up and down and up and down. And, like 20 years ago, we saw some superhero films, but then we saw more drama, more comedies, more drama features, and then ramped it back up into a fantasy-style genre. So, as I think our generation our generation is so apt to have an escape from the real world that it's time for us. I mean, that's what it is, time for us to go off into our little escape. Let's watch a comic book film. Right. So that's just my opinion.
Hey, thanks so much for watching today, and also, we'd like to hear what you have to say about comic book movies influencing the movie industry. So comment below so we can have a discussion about that. And thank you so much for liking and subscribing to this video.
And if you have any questions that you'd like for us to discuss on the show, email us at addmovieshow@gmail.com or hit us up at the various social media at ADD Movie Show. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm Stephen Whitten.
And I'm Ryan Ramsey, and we'll see you again on the next catastrophe.